Hi. Good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon to all of you out in the stratosphere watching this today on the live stream. I am Andrew Racinos, and I am the Executive Vice President here at the Tessitura Network, and I am so excited for today's keynote panel. But first, can we talk about conferences? There are so many conferences in the world of arts and culture. There are symphony conferences and museum and performing arts center and zoo and aquarium, ticketing, development, marketing, IT, digital, education, so many conferences. But here's the fun part. So next week, for those of you who are here, next week when you go back to the office, if someone were to come up to you and give you a list of the types of conferences and say, which type of conference did you go to last week? You could reasonably say, all of the above. Am I right? I mean, we are the meta conference for arts and culture. But even outside the walls of this conference, this community draws such great strength from our diversity of genre and of discipline. In fact, I would posit that the two greatest strengths of this community are our diversity of genre and our spirit of collaboration. And today, with this keynote panel, we are going to celebrate those dual strengths and shine a light on cross-genre collaboration in our community. Not just because it's inspiring and awesome, but because we can. There is such a diversity of organizations in our community. Now, some of you tweet, so I'm going to give you today's panel in tweet form. Each panelist will discuss a cross-genre collaboration at their organization. And the panel itself, also a cross-genre collaboration. It is a recursive panel. That was all the developers who just laughed. When we were envisioning this session, Kristen Olson, our awesome Director of Learning Resources, came to Jack and Don and me, and she said flat out, the dream moderator for this panel would be Julie Burstein. And as Kristen knows, sometimes dreams come true. Julie Burstein is a Peabody Award-winning radio producer. She is the creator and the founding executive producer of public radio's Studio 360. Julie's book, Spark: How Creativity Works, was then turned into her own TED Talk, 4 Lessons in Creativity, that has been viewed more than 1.6 million times. We first met Julie at one of our great community members, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Julie is the creative advisor and the director for TEDx Met, the first TEDx to be held at an art museum. And she was so generous with her time when we were envisioning Tessitura's Innovator Series. So let's see, arts, culture, collaboration, creativity. It's no wonder that Julie gets us here in the Tessitura community and why Kristen imagined and saw that dream in the making. So it is with such great pleasure that I welcome the moderator for today's panel, Julie Burstein.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here because all of you do the kind of work that I do, which is you work with the arts. And through my work with artists and creative organizations, it's become very clear to me that anytime we want to create something new, we need to, as they say on trains and subways, mind the gap. Creativity requires the ability and also the courage to both be in those gaps and to bridge them. To bridge the gaps between collaborators, sometimes within our own organizations, between groups in the community, between what we know and what we hope for, between the old and the new. There's power in that gap and in the distance between us. But we have to watch how wide that gap is. The size of the gap matters. And if you think about the way a spark works in our cars, the spark in a spark plug jumps between the center electrode and the ground. Without what's called the spark gap, there's no ignition. There's no burst of power to make the car go. That gap has to be just the right size for the spark to do its work and begin combustion. Too big, and nothing happens. Too small, nothing happens. Our panelists have all created partnerships at just the right distance for the creative spark to jump across. And not just with the usual collaborators. We're going to hear about an orchestra that's partnered with a laser light company that usually works with rock stars and Super Bowl halftime shows. A Shakespearean theater that has galvanized arts groups and restaurants across an entire city to honor the bard. And a museum that has put art supplies in the hands of children who are going into the hospital and has grown tons of food for a food bank. So that we can dive right into the conversation, I'd like to briefly introduce our three panelists. Alida Szabo grew up in Washington, D.C., and she told me last night that one of the reasons she went to Mount Vernon was because that's where her parents met on a double date. While she was growing up here, she went to see all the shows that were on Broadway. And then she went on to get her master's in urban design. She's had leadership positions at many different Chicago cultural institutions and has been the director of audience development at Chicago Shakespeare Theater since 1998. Sherri Prentiss grew up in Chicago, and her mother loved music. Sherri has worked in classical music organizations in Wisconsin and is vice president of marketing for the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, where she's worked since 2007. And I just learned in her free time, Sherri is a chocolatier. Rand Suffolk moved with his family to Rome when he was 15 years old. While they lived there, his mother took him to all the important museums, but he said he spent most of his time looking at the beautiful girls. It was later, at college, that an art history course sparked his passion for working in art museums. Rand was the director of the Hyde Museum in New York and the Philbrook in Oklahoma, and just 9 months ago, he went to Atlanta to become the leader of the High Museum. Please join me in welcoming Alida, Sherri, and Rand. I want to begin by giving everyone here just a brief idea of not all of your creative collaborations, but just a few. And Sherri, I wanted to start with you because you're fresh from the Cincinnati Symphony's latest Luminosity. It just ended on Sunday, right?
1 a.m. yesterday, yes.
And I heard that at 1 a.m. you had a broom and were sweeping the plaza outside the concert hall.
We all do what it takes, yes.
I think everyone here can relate to that.
Yeah.
Let's watch a little video that your team quickly put together of what happened this past weekend.
Done here. That's fantastic.
I don't think it was just fancy production. That looks like it was incredibly exciting over the past few days.
It was. The event was born in 2013, and so this was a re-envisioning. We called it Luminosity Reimagined, sort of 4 years later. Started off as a way to introduce our music director to the community back in 2013, and we thought, well, how could we do that? We thought, free concert in the park, that's what we need to do. And hey, let's add some lights. So it turned into a 3D projection mapping visual project that was synchronized to live orchestra. And as we sort of leaned into some curiosity and experimentation, we discovered that it was the first time on this continent that those two things had been brought together, we believe. No one's disputed that claim, and here's a look back at, actually this was last year. I believe that was from year one. So, you know, we put on this event over 2 nights in 2013, and 30,000 people showed up, and we thought, oh, well, we might have something here.
So 30,000 people is a little different from what happens inside your walls at the concert hall, right?
Indeed. Yeah, we were talking a little bit about this off stage and sort of the transition from an outdoor performance to an indoor performance. When we launched this event in 2013, the feedback that we got from the community was, of course, overwhelming. It was free to attend at that point. And folks, it was described as a tipping point for the city, because what you're looking at there is a former dilapidated park in the urban core of Cincinnati that no one would set foot in. Maybe if we can show slide 5 or from my deck. It's sort of a before and after of the park. And slide 6 shows it under construction. And then if you cut to slide 7, so that's Luminosity year 1. So this is what I think our proudest moment was when we realized that citizens from the neighborhood were also enjoying a shared experience with people from the suburbs. And it's not often that you can bring those two groups of people together, and this event did that. So we decided to repeat it a few more times.
And this year, you had a different challenge in that you didn't do it outside in the park because you're about to renovate your symphony hall.
Right.
Tell us about the space in which you had Luminosity this year and how things changed.
Certainly. So that beautiful old building that you saw is Music Hall. That's on the National Historic Register. It was built in the late 1800s. It is the performance home of the Cincinnati Symphony, Cincinnati Pops, opera, ballet, and May Festival. And right now it's full of cranes and construction fencing. So we took the opportunity to introduce our home away from home, which is the Taft Theater, also a historic venue in downtown Cincinnati, so just a stone's throw from Music Hall, but a place that doesn't really get a whole lot of love and attention when it comes to arts and culture. This is a performance venue in terms of bringing in rock shows and comedy acts that we manage, but we're taking it over for the year. So we decided to create a block party outside of the Taft Theater and hold the 3D projection mapped visual show on the inside of the theater. So we did 10 shows back to back over 3 days to allow as many people as possible to attend. So over 20,000 people over those 3 days came in through our doors, and several more thousand on the block party to enjoy the free arts and entertainment that was happening outside.
Did you find, now having done this for several years, that there's a difference in the way that the audience responds when they're outside versus when they're inside a venue?
Certainly people were a little bit more reluctant to bring out their phones and videotape the performance and share it. So it became less shareable this year, which I think is one of the key takeaways and learnings for me, is just when you change the character, the essence of the event, also there will be consequences for that. So, you know, there's a lot less activity on Twitter and social media as a result. But the outdoor block party elements help to balance that a little bit, because there everyone had their phones out all the time. So it's something that we're assessing in terms of how, well, this was the 4th and final Luminosity. We are moving on to other experimentation to open up the mind space for that. But it's something that we'll be thinking more about in terms of how do we continue to ensure that the experience is both participatory and shareable.
You know, luminosity is so embedded in the city. I want to turn to you, Alida, to talk about how Chicago Shakespeare has taken Shakespeare and embedded it throughout Chicago. And one of the partnerships that your organization created that I found most interesting was with restaurants throughout the city. Let's watch a short video that shows us a little bit about what is called the Culinary Complete Works.
So we found out that we were doing Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew, which was great for us because it's all about gender roles. Taming down the shrew, which is Katharina, she became the main protein of the dish, which is poussin, which is a small game bird. Underneath, there's a little bit of foie gras inside, which helps develop her character through the plate. So the cooking process, you take the foie gras and you're basting her and developing her into something else at the end. And then asparagus, there's some cooling elements to it. It did a little bit of pickling on the asparagus to kind of cut through her, to kind of tame that flavor.
We're an all-female team here at the boarding house, and so we thought it was rather appropriate for us to take one of the more sort of misogynistic tones of Taming of the Shrew and then tame it ourselves with our interpretation.
I love the way that they approached the Taming of the Shrew and creatively made something that you wouldn't have expected, I think, from that.
You know, I'm glad you selected that example because one of our goals was programming that was accessible and programming that was surprising. And I think this fit in the latter category. But we were joining the world that was celebrating 400 years of Shakespeare's legacy. And we wanted to demonstrate how his words inspired both innovation and creativity across cultures, across time, across disciplines. So this was an effort to really unite around a common inspiration, not a theme, but an inspiration. And the Culinary Complete Works was the brainchild of Rick Boynton, our creative producer, Doreen Sai, and Alpana Singh, who you saw in that video. She owns a restaurant, but she's quite a personality in the culinary scene in Chicago, and she helped engage all of these different restaurateurs and chefs, and they all did a different thing. Every one of them, it might have been a dish, it might have been a meal, it might have been an event, and some of them were quite surprising.
And it went beyond the famous and big restaurants too, right? You went within various communities.
That was an effort to really involve the larger community. We have like Rick Bayless, who some of you may know on a PBS channel, and a lot of Art Smith and a lot of other well-known chefs, James Beard, award-winning chefs. But we also had a lot of chefs in the community. And my favorite, which I was telling you before we came on the stage, is a bakery in a community that took Titus Andronicus.
That's a dark play.
I just really was curious what he was going to do with that. And he's making a pie of pork and blood sausage. And then there's a gelato restaurant. They have two locations, I think one in Lakeview and one, I'm not sure where the other location is, but she took Hamlet and she made blue Hamlet with Danish blue cheese, vanilla bean, and pecans. So I mean, I just thought it was just really interesting how when you engage people outside in the communities, how creative they can be and how engaged they can be in the program.
Another interesting collaboration from looking at, you have more than 1,000 things going on within the city of Chicago. One that really struck me was with the Pritzker Military Museum, which upon reflection I thought, oh, military museum, Shakespeare, it makes a lot of sense.
That project's in process right now. We are in rehearsal now with Barbara Gaines, our artistic director's history cycle called Tug of War. The first part was called Foreign Fire, regarding foreign wars, and now we're in rehearsal for Civil Strife, which is like the War of the Roses. We talk about it as the ultimate Game of Thrones. And what we decided is partnering with the Pritzker Museum enabled us to spread Shakespeare throughout the community, and we'll have actors going in and taping various excerpts of plays and so forth. And the museum has the ability to get it to a variety of bases and locations. So we're still working on the distribution of it, but it is beginning now.
And I noticed from some of the images like this one that contemporary military culture has infused some of the performances that you've created.
Yes, you know, it's really interesting. We had 2 Othellos on the bill. This one, directed by Jonathan Mumby, a British director who actually directed the current production of The Merchant of Venice that is from the Globe and is now on our stage. So it's interesting, he directed during this year Othello and The Merchant of Venice, the 2 kind of outsider plays. And this one takes place in a kind of tropical, contemporary, Guantanamo Bay location. And the other Othello that we did was a work that we commissioned from the Q Brothers, the Chicago hip-hop artist duo. It's Othello the Remix. And we commissioned that for the Globe's Olympiad in 2012, and it actually premiered on Globe stage, and I understand it was one of the first times they ever actually mic'd actors on the Globe stage. This work went all over the world, and we brought it back to Chicago for this event, and I understand it's opening in New York in the fall, the West Side Arts Center.
Oh, good.
So you can
As a New Yorker, that makes me happy. Rand, I want to turn to you, and you've just been at the High Museum for 9 months. So much of what I think we'll talk about is from your tenure at Philbrook. But I wanted to ask you first about an interesting collaboration between the museum and a hospital in town. How did that come about?
Well, it really had its origins in another program that we were doing. Sorry, I don't have a video. I threatened an interpretive dance component, but anyways. So you'll see down in this little girl, she has this little green box. And back in 2008, we launched a program called My Museum. And at its core, it's a kid-driven, family-oriented program that really encourages repeat visitation. Children come to the museum, they get this little kit for free. Inside are 3 art-making components, a pad of paper, a pencil, and an eraser. We also give them an art card every month, which focuses on a work of art either in the permanent collection or a special exhibition. You flip the card over, there's a paragraph about the object and the artist that created it. There's 3 to 5 questions for the caregiver to ask that child to engage him or her regarding the work. And then there may be 3 to 5 different art activities specified for the child to do that are inspired by that work. Every month, the child comes back, they get their kit stamped, we give another art-making component for their kit, and they get another art card. So that's the program, and we launched that in 2008, and by the time I left just last year, we had over 25,000 children that had participated in that program. About 3 years ago, some staff got together and we've been approached by St. Francis Children's Hospital in Tulsa about the possibility of participating on a day event, sort of a festival that they were having on the hospital campus. And the question at that time was whether or not it would be appropriate for us to use some surplus My Museum components for that day, the cards and so forth. And what ultimately happened was rather quickly, we kind of decided to blow that idea up. And the short version of it is that ultimately we created a program that we called My Museum Mobile. And we partnered with St. Francis Children's Hospital, got some funding and some volunteer support from the Junior League of Tulsa. And they came in and we did a pilot program where every single child that was admitted into the pediatric oncology unit there was given one of those kits. Really a remarkable opportunity to give them some structured, fun, a wonderful distraction from a pretty awful time in their life. We would throw some free passes in so parents could, if they wanted to get out of that situation, could come to the museum, see some things that were beautiful, walk through our gorgeous gardens and so forth. It was a really a remarkable program. And before I left, that program had been expanded so that every child that had been admitted into the hospital itself ultimately was given one of those kits.
Well, as a parent who, my son was in the hospital for 3 weeks at one point when he was 7, we would have done anything for that kind of distraction, and so that's a wonderful program. How long did it take to put that program in place? It sounds like the hospital approached you when you said, hey, let's give kits to kids who come in. Did they say, great?
They really didn't say great. I think that they had a lot of logistical concerns. There were some privacy issues. There was some training issues for the volunteers. Our wonderful idea, I think, ultimately, by the time it was all said and done, between the training and the recruiting, getting the funding in place to make it happen. I mean, it was months, actually, before we were finally able to do it, but well worth it in the long run.
This leads to a question that I want to ask all three of you, which is, these kinds of unexpected pairings, surprising you used, Alida, they take time. How do you encourage your teams to think in ways that allows you to think longer term rather than, oh, okay, this one's going to be, we put A with B and we get C? We could start with you, Rand, if you've got a thought about that.
Well, I think for us, one of the things that I think is so important about a program like this is that we had a team that was prepared to blow it up, right? I mean, we talked a lot at Philbrook, and we're talking a lot now at the High about what I call the mantra of our DNA, which is growth, inclusivity, collaboration, and connectivity.
Slow down, because I'm not sure everybody's heard all those three. So.
I'll say it again. Where's my staff? They should say it. Growth, inclusivity, collaboration, and connectivity. I want that to be the white noise of our existence. I want it to be the stuff that informs all the decisions that we make or the actions we take as an organization. We need to be hardwired to default towards identifying those opportunities and then positioning ourselves to capture them when they come to us. And I think that my museum is a great example of that. It could have been very easy for us to just show up on that one day and give away some stuff, and it would have been perfectly lovely, and that would have been great. But we kind of paused and said, that doesn't feel like us. We'll do that, but what feels like us is that we could do something different. And I think that what was exciting about that is that again and again, it really is about how do you ultimately use these partnerships to dovetail strengths and needs? Because it doesn't matter how large you are or how small you are, you're going to have needs, or how successful you are. And so finding the right strategic partner to kind of move forward together with is vitally important.
Just building on, sorry, Alida. Building on what Rand just said about it being baked into your core values of the organization is how I think in our organization as well, we've been able to create the bandwidth, both human and financial, to take on a project like Luminosity or the other more experimental things that we do. So we rewrote our mission and vision statement a couple of years ago. And we kind of whittled down our mission statement from a couple paragraphs long to 5 words: to seek and share inspiration. And our former mission statement was mostly about musical excellence, and we consider that now to be the price of admission. That's expected. And this became our why. So we also created this vision statement to engage audiences and community better than any other orchestra in the world. That's the last part, is the aspirational part, right? I offered to fly around the world and benchmark us. No one's taken me up on that yet. But so this idea of we're leaning toward experimentation, which is one of our core values. And as an orchestra, that's a big deal. Because we're the most tradition-bound, I feel, of any arts and culture institution. And leaning towards curiosity, because we know that when we feel that we have been at our best in these recent years with projects where we sought inspiration as much as when we decided that we were deliverers of inspiration, when we were taking in that inspiration to feed it back to the community in new ways.
Did Luminosity play any part with this work towards a new mission statement?
Absolutely. It was the astounding success of Luminosity and then a few other projects that I can name on one hand. Our Classical Roots project, One City, One Symphony, our Music Now Contemporary Music collaboration, where we're, in all 4 of those cases, partnering with different collaborators. So for Luminosity, it's primarily visual artist-based, and just learning to get on the same page with them and speak the same language was, in the beginning, a challenge. They're like, what's a crescendo? I think I know. So it's sort of like you start to speak to each other in new ways. Classical Roots is a partnership with our African American churches in our community and the music ministers who lead those programs. One City, One Symphony has a number of collaborators. And sometimes you have to be willing to give up a little bit of control, which for us was really hard and still hard. But we're learning that when we kind of take one hand off the wheel and let someone else drive with us, that it turns out these projects that have the most resonance in the community out of anything else that we do.
And that echoes something I know, Alida, you think about, which is what does an organization keep hold of and what do you let your partners control?
One of the things that we've held on to and that I think is in the DNA of our organization from the top down is certainly a curiosity about the world and also an engagement with the community. And I think those two things are very evident in the culmination of this festival. As a Shakespeare Theater, of course, we're sewn into the curriculum. So we've served over 1 million students in our 30 years in Chicago and 40,000 students and teachers a year. So we are out in the community and engaging with people. And also now we're in the 5th year of our Free Shakespeare in the Parks. And we go to 19 communities, and doing something year after year after year is when you really begin to develop those relationships that are authentic so that you can go back from year to year and develop them further. And the international part of it, I think, has always been in Barbara Gaines, our artistic director, and Chris Henderson, our executive director, is part of their DNA. And we actually, when we moved to Navy Pier in '99, began to expand our programming. And one of the areas, aside from family theater and musicals and new plays, was actually bringing in companies from around the world. In the 80s, there was an international theater festival in Chicago that lasted for a very brief moment in time, and people remembered it and missed it, and we felt that we could be that conduit for international artists to be on our stage. And so Barbara and Chris have traveled the world and engaged with festival producers around the world and developed relationships with them. And we came up with the World Stage series, which for the last 10 or more years, we've every year brought in people. So that enabled us with this festival to reach out to bring in companies just in September from Mexico, India, China, a number of countries, so that kind of opened up the world, not just to us in working with theater artists in completely different modes of operation, but also to our community in seeing what theater can be. And I think those two things, the community and the world view, is really what motivated us and is evident in the festival.
So what I'm hearing from all three of you is that these sorts of things take a leader who says, this is what's important to this organization. It's interesting, and it's only hitting me now seeing the three of you together. You're all working with art forms that in some cases are thousands of years old, hundreds of years old, and you're bringing them to a contemporary audience. And all of these things that you're talking about allow you to bridge that gap between work that was created in other times and a contemporary audience.
For sure. Go ahead.
Just great work is timeless, and there will always be creative people in the world to bring it to a contemporary audience.
Yeah, I just wanted to call up slide 9 really quickly as sort of evidence of art has the power, as we know, to connect people. But unless we invite those people in to the experience, they don't know that they're invited. And so this is a shot from a couple of years ago. We went around in a van and videotaped people around the community and then put their faces on the facade of Music Hall. And everybody we filmed was on the building at some point, some for just a moment and some for longer stretches of time. This was performed in synchronized to Fanfare for the Common Man, which is a piece that the CSO commissioned. And so I felt really passionate about this particular piece, but about this project for that reason.
And what a perfect pairing of people from Cincinnati with a piece of music that we all now know, but that began there. Rand, I wanted to ask you about another collaboration that was one of the ones when I was reading about the work that you did at Philbrook that just astonished and delighted me, and that was the work that you did growing food for a food bank. Can you tell us how that began?
Sure, and I think that it really, you were talking about the leadership part of it, and I think what's so important about these things is that you really have to rely on the leadership across the entire organization to, again, identify and execute on these things. And this is a great example of that. Back in 2009, when the world turned upside down financially, our senior staff, we made cuts like everyone else had. And we got together after that as a team, and I said, okay, that was the easy part. Might have been a little bit painful, but that was kind of the easy part. I said, now we need to be the one organization in town that tries to do more. While everyone around us is focused on retrenchment or cutting back on their programs and so forth, how can we be the one organization in town that does more? For those of you that are unfamiliar with Philbrook, we're blessed. It's on 25 acres of beautiful formal and informal gardens. And about 2 weeks after that initial meeting, our garden manager came in my office and she said, Rand, the spring plantings are going to be light this year in the South Formal Garden. Oh, but I got an idea. She said, what I'd like to do is I want to turn it into a French potager garden. And I said, that's fantastic. What the hell is that? And she said, well, it's a decorative vegetable garden. And she said, we're going to design it, plan it, and take care of it. And then I want to reach out to the food bank of Eastern Oklahoma. And if they can come up with 75 to 100 volunteers, they can have all that fresh produce. Well, for the food bank, as you know, or many of you may know, fresh produce is sort of the holy grail. They use it not only to feed people with, but to teach with, and so forth. And we ultimately did that program for 2 years. It was gorgeous. It was beautiful. But we also ended up donating over 2.25 tons of fresh produce to the food bank.
It's such a wonderful story, and you said this as you prefaced your remarks. This is about leadership, but it's about empowering the team to be able to bring an idea like that to you. And I'm interested from all three of you, if you have a sense of what's essential within our organizations to allow for this kind of thinking that goes beyond what we're all familiar with. What is it within your organizations that allows for that kind of, for the head gardener to be able to say, I have an idea?
I think for us, well, I can speak for myself when I'm hiring and we look for these qualities when we're bringing people in is adaptability and resilience. I would say
the big
both
word
of those
these days.
in equal measure, because a lot of what we're attempting to do in Cincinnati, we don't know if it's going to work out. And so you have to be ready to take the heat and accept that, we might have to experience failure. And we don't have, as arts organizations in general, a lot of headroom for failure, certainly not innovation capital that allows us to spend and fail the way that for-profit companies do. So the stakes feel kind of higher in a way. So those are definitely two traits that have served us well, those who have survived all 4 luminosities.
It's interesting though, institutionally, because it's not a for-profit company, how do you carve out, as you said before, the headspace and the finances to be able to take those risks?
Yeah, well, I can't speak for our fundraising team. Personally, though, I am involved in fundraising for some of these special projects, and I have found that, money follows vision. So if you've got a really exciting project that is rooted in strategy or audience insight, community insight, connecting to what the community needs, that those are easy, relatively easy to fund. Raising money is never easy, right? development friends, but I find that it's easier to raise money for these types of projects than it is for our main stage programming, which is another challenge that we could do a whole keynote on. You know, it's like, well, what about all that other great stuff that we have? And one of our metrics for success around Luminosity is conversion of attendance at Luminosity, if you're a new to system buyer, to seeing something inside the hall. So we try to connect you to what we actually do the other 51 weeks of the year. And we've seen some moderate success, but it's certainly not enough to fill, you know, fill any budget gaps anytime soon. So I feel like that is the real challenge, is how do you put on these special projects? It's easier to fundraise for them, but then making sure that that excitement and energy translates to everything else that you're doing.
Can I go back just to what you were, your real initial question about this? And I think, what are, in terms of the essential ingredients? I mean, as we were talking here, I was thinking about the fact that I think that there's, you know, 2 or 3 things that really are vital. One is, and I would lean back on, you know, Sherri and the symphony's kind of commitment to world domination. I mean, I think it almost goes without saying, but it doesn't, right? And that we all have to be so passionate. We have to be true missionaries regarding our art forms, and we have to believe that at the end of the day, like any other nonprofit, we exist to make the world a better place, right? That's what we do. And for art museums, our goal is to make the world a better place via engagement with complex visual culture. And for the other disciplines in this room, you have your own filters that you use to kind of approach the world. But with that kind of conviction and passion, if you can marry that with a commitment to being bold and to taking risks and to kind of positioning yourselves with an expectation that to some degree or another, we're gonna own creativity in this town. And this is what we're gonna do with it. I think that's so important for a staff to feel empowered, to know that that's an expectation, and to try and figure out new ways, always, constantly, to make sense for your community, to really dovetail those strengths and needs.
I think one of the key factors in my experience is imaginative, contagious leadership.
I love that.
and I feel that that is really what has ignited the community of people it takes to do this sort of thing. And that kind of enthusiasm is really what also brings in a lot of partners to an engagement. And I think, I agree with what you're saying, the more partners you have, obviously projects like that are easier to fundraise with, although nothing is easy. But I think the idea of taking that enthusiasm and that leadership and spreading it into the communities is something that really strengthens an organization in many ways.
And I look at the 3 of you, imaginative, creative leadership is right here on this stage, and I have a feeling throughout this hall. Sherri, you raised an interesting point, which is that these sorts of exciting, surprising experiences, which I know because I come from the media loves, because they can say, as I said in my introduction, they're working with a lighting group that usually does halftime shows for the Super Bowl. Bringing it back to the day-to-day within your organization, it sounds like can be a challenge.
For sure. I think what projects like this have helped us do is broaden our awareness in the community. We've been around 120 plus years and maybe feel a little bit taken for granted from time to time. We travel the world and have sold 10 million recordings worldwide, and yet there's so many people in our own backyard who haven't experienced us. And so certainly, you know, parks, concerts, and plays in the park, and all of this really help to broaden awareness in our audience. I mentioned luminosity in particular was described by the local media as a tipping point for the neighborhood, which is undergoing a renaissance or gentrification, depending on your point of view. And so it's to be part of that conversation, I think, is where we want to be, rather than taking a back seat. And I feel as though luminosity has helped us in that it brought people down to the urban core where they didn't think to necessarily go before. It changed the way they felt about the arts, about the neighborhood, about the city, and by extension, how they feel about themselves. Because I believe that that civic pride element that can be generated from having these shared experiences is one that just elevates you and your feeling about what it's like to live in that city. And can I share my prop too?
You sure can.
So I brought this t-shirt. I was gonna wear it, but I thought it'd be easier to show. So when it comes to an event like Luminosity, it helps that with the awareness building because people kind of market for us. So, you know, the media markets for us, and then, you know, people like the Popsicle Shop release a Lemonosity pop, and then we've got the local t-shirt guy who releases t-shirts that say, Cincinnati, our orchestra has frickin' laser beams. So, yeah, we didn't ask him to do this, they just did it, and a lot of our staff members wear these with pride. So I feel like how that translates is there's just more buzz. You know, people are talking about the CSO in ways that they hadn't been talking about us before, if they were talking about us at all. And that's the space that gets me really excited as an arts administrator, is that we want to be part of contemporary culture and part of the relevant conversation happening in our communities. The only way to do that is to kind of break through the clutter sometimes.
I can sympathize with that, being a Shakespeare Theater, and trying to elevate and redefine what that means. Is it a good housekeeping seal of approval, or is it guys in pumpkin pants parading on the stage? I think part of connecting ourselves to the larger community, whether it's our CSO, Chicago Symphony Orchestra, or the Lyric Opera.
They're pretty good too, by the way.
Or the Joffrey Ballet, but also all of our other community of colleagues, because we work with the Chicago Public Libraries and the public schools and smaller arts organizations, and I think it made Shakespeare relevant to see it in all of these different forms, embraced by all of these different people. And I think that's what engages us and gets us excited, so that people see us in a completely different way, and we're insinuated in all corners of the community.
It is interesting that we began this conversation talking about theater and music and art, but really what we're talking about is community. And that, I know, Rand, when we spoke on the phone a couple of weeks ago, you had just left a meeting with Habitat for Humanity. Can you tell us a little bit about that meeting and what happened?
Well, this goes to the part of maybe the long view. But we had some wonderful team members at the High that started talking about, there was a new granting opportunity that had come up, and they were looking at different partners, and they talked about the possibility of perhaps working with Habitat and somehow creating, you know, maybe an art library in each of those houses that were being built and so forth. And again, I think, I mean, this stuff doesn't always, certainly does not come from the top, but those that have worked with me know it's hard for me to let well enough alone. And so we started really talking about it, and at the end of it, it became a much, you know, it was kind of like, well, that would be okay, but wouldn't it be way more interesting if we reached out to, you know, Georgia Tech and got a couple architects and engineers, and then we reached out to Emory and got some childhood, you know, early childhood learning specialists, and then we took some team members from the High and a few people from, you know, we had 9 people in a room with Habitat, and we start talking about, okay, how do we change the entire design of your home so that it will engender creative spaces and creativity within these families, and what would that look like, and how do we create a problem set that we could challenge ourselves with that would ultimately do that, so that at the end of the day, we were creating a national model for Atlanta Habitat, which could be deconstructed or shared wholesale with different habitats around the country. That was really exciting. I'm not sure Habitat is entirely on board with that just yet. But because we met with them and we started a conversation. But that, I think, that's what that meeting was about. I'm still committed to trying to see if we can move that forward. But I think that's really exciting. And I think one of the things that I would just pause and kind of touch on is, just by listening, is that for me, one of the things that's very important about these collaborations is that it's so important to move beyond the usual suspects. You know, we've talked a lot about partnerships and so forth, and I think philosophically, we've talked a lot about with in Philbrook and now at the High about, you know, how can it be, you know, 25% we'll do with the usual suspects. You know, we're committed to those. It's important for us to do continuing work with, you know, the library and the symphony and the theater and so forth. Those are really important. But really, we only want that to be about 25% of who we're partnering with. The other 75%, we want to be with very different nonprofit organizations. Because what is so important about that is that every time we get involved with one of those organizations, as you can imagine, it challenges us to think about our mission in new and creative ways. But at the same time, it gives us an opportunity to engage different segments of our community than otherwise we ever would have had a chance to engage. And so I think that's so important, also kind of looking at it from that perspective, because that's really where some of the most interesting challenges and ultimately solutions come from.
So all of you now have been involved in these sorts of collaborations for quite a while. If you look back, do you have anything that you would say to your earlier self when you were just getting started? Anything that you would say back when you were just beginning these kinds of things to help through the journey to get to where you are now?
I would say that, you know, building on what Rand just said, look outside of your normal sphere of collaborators, but also at some point just launch. Because I feel like collaborations take a lot of time, that's for sure, but sometimes it can feel like the talking just goes on and on. Has this ever happened to anybody? Talking is lovely, but you know, you either have to launch something and just try it and see what happens. We talk occasionally in our organization about small experiments with radical intent. That came from another consultant out there, but I love that idea of just, it doesn't have to be huge on the scale of, you know, a monumental park production or, you know, feeding 1,000 people through a food bank collaboration. But if we just start small and just launch something, sometimes that's enough to learn whether or not it's got legs.
In the design world, they call that fast prototyping.
Yes.
Where you try something, you see what happens, you try it again.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
I think also it's a matter of not being afraid of it, not being fully successful the first time. I mean, it's like piloting, like anything else. You try again. And for us in reaching out to different communities with the international work, we're trying more and more to bring, Chicago is a very diverse community, and we're trying more and more to bring different people in. And we find over time in our continuing programming, we are bringing these different audiences in, but you can't just stop the first time. You have to keep going.
So it's important to try things, and it's important to understand that not everything works, and to keep moving.
Keep going.
Rand.
I think I would just kind of remind myself to start with what you're already doing, as opposed to trying to reinvent something all the time, or to create something rather anew, which is important. But from a start standpoint, can you take an existing program and use that same platform in a different way? And again, how, in so doing, how will that make you better, stronger? I mean, I think it's great to kind of be open to those kinds of ideas, because it's, again, you can't deliver all of it yourself as an organization. So how do you become better together? And again, use something that it's kind of working smarter, right? If you don't have the resources to create a bunch of new programs, just take what you're doing and see how that can become a different platform of engagement for collaboration.
I think my last question to all of you, because collaboration, as you've been talking about, means letting go of some of the control, but it also means finding the right partners. if each of you could just talk about when you're in that talking phase, how do you evaluate which organization is going to be a good partner for what you're trying to do?
I think partnerships are like any other relationship, and they start small, and they always have a beginning. And we've had many partnerships with some of our colleagues over the years, so that it's not surprising that they would join us now. But when we did something such as going out into the parks, we realized that we had to find the community leaders in that park that would really engage and be a part of this project. And we're in our 5th year, but it's taken a while, whether it's the alderman, whether it's the community organization with the park, whether it's a social organization, whatever it is, it's over time you have to find those people. So there isn't a right or wrong partner. I think sometimes there are multiple partners. And you have to find a way of energizing all of them and synergizing them.
And it sounds like it takes a lot of conversations to find the ones with whom you can work.
I was just going to say, the way that we sort of measure interest is just whether or not, how quickly they call you back. I mean, people are so busy, it sounds so simple, but you know, there have been collaborations where you're trying to set a meeting or that next discussion, and you know, it's really hard. And it's been a good barometer, actually, of how the partnership is going to go. Because those that we've tried to ram through by pulling all of the weight, they're never successful. So it's really kind of easy to tell right out of the gate.
That's a good marker.
Can I go back and answer the last question again?
Absolutely.
Because I think I would tell myself something different, actually,
Okay.
when I really
Good.
thought about it.
That'll be fine. You can answer any question you want.
I think what I would tell myself is that it's so important for those programs to be intentional, and that it's so important as an organization to focus first on developing credibility within your community. People need to know that you're sincere. People need to know that you're not pandering. People need to know that you're not simply being opportunistic, that you need to have that credibility, which I think is so important. And then I think it's wildly necessary to be able to execute. I mean, I don't think any of the programs that we've been talking about, or I'll just speak to the ones that were kind of done in my sphere of service, those weren't necessarily rocket science. I mean, but at the end of the day, you had a team and an organization that was able to truly deliver, that could execute. And I think that those 3 things are so important. And I think that they're important when you're looking for partners too, to kind of bring it to this question. I mean, everybody should have ownership of something and an expectation that they're going to be able to deliver whatever that is.
Well, I'm looking at our time and realizing our time is up. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and it's clear that the sparks of ideas that you have all lifted for us are things that everybody here gets to take away with them and think about those kinds of partnerships, collaborations, both internal and external, that they can begin to play with. So I just want to say thank you so much to Alida Szabo, Sherri Prentiss, and Rand.
Thank you.
Rand Suffolk, thank you. And I just want to turn to you and say thank you for being such a wonderful audience. I hope you have some things to think about and play with as you go off and enjoy your intermission. So thank you so much.